I'll be speaking with Joseph Daher. He's Syrian Swiss, a left activist, and a founder of Syria Freedom Forever, that blog on the internet. He teaches history at Lausanne University. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for the invitation.
We're talking a few days before the second anniversary of the terrible chemical attacks in Ghouta, Syria. The United Nations report showed the attacks took a terrible toll, over 1,000 people, many of them children, but it didn't say who committed the attack. The U.S. government said it was Assad forces. What do you, as a supporter of the Syrian revolution, believe?
No, I believe, and many facts have proven that the regime is responsible for this massacre, another one that has been committed 2 years ago in Ghouta, just like other massacres. There's no doubt of the responsibility of the regime in this massacre.
I mean, they denied it, and the Russians sort of made a half-hearted denial. Go ahead.
The Assad regime still denies the massacre of Hama in '82. So if we will hear or believe the regime's officials, will not even believe that the revolutionary process started in 2011 in Syria, and that all the protesters were only terrorists or infiltrated gang groups supported from foreign states. So the official regime line is not even to be trusted on any kind of to be serious.
No. What about there's a Syrian nun who most call Mother Agnes. Some people here in the United States listen to her. She said that some of the videos were faked or manipulated.
This is the usual propaganda of the regime, and Mother Agnes is not different to this. I just remind that she's very close to the Assad regime and to people very close, political parties close to the Assad regime. So she's been kind of traveling all over the world and acting as a spokesperson of the Assad regime as well, unfortunately, and invited very widely in different Western countries.
What is the area? What is Ghouta like now? What forces are active there?
Ghouta is still besieged for more than a year. The regime, just what happened yesterday, bombed Douma, which is a city in the Ghouta, killing more than 100 people and injuring even more. That targeted children, women, men, civilians. Most of they targeted actually a market. And the Ghouta is, generally speaking, under the fire constantly of the regime, and has been besieged, there's a blocus on this region by the Assad regime. On the other side, in Ghouta, you also have Islamic fundamentalist forces repressing popular protesters, democratic activists, especially the main Islamic fundamentalist force in the region of Ghouta is the Islamic Army, which is led by Zahran al-Loush, that arrested and repressed a lot of activists, including very famous activist Ghazan Zaytoune and her colleagues in 13 December. So as elsewhere in Syria, the popular movement, which has been very much attacked first by the regime, but again, the popular movement suffering from these two counter-revolutionary forces. In addition to the hard livings of the blocus imposed by the Assad regime, lack of food, lack of electricity, etc., a destruction of infrastructure, etc.
We're freezing from time to time. I hope the video comes out good. in terms of Ghouta, does the popular forces also have force of arms, or is the only weapons with the Islamic group?
The main armed groups in the Ghouta region are mainly composed of Islamic fundamentalist forces led by the Islamic Army of Zahran al-Lush. But you had since even for more than a year popular protest on a usual on a nearly weekly basis, notably from democratic to complain to condemn the repressive practices of Islamic army, and usual actually protest of women, of mothers of prisoners, or sisters coming out in the street and protesting against the Islamic army, even trying their prisons, etc. And other democratic activists also went out very often. And just last Friday, you had a huge demonstration condemning the Assad regime and saying we need to continue the revolution on the basis of what it was started. It means democracy, social justice, and sectarianism, against sectarianism. Sorry.
That was in Ghouta?
Yes, last Friday. Huge demonstration.
Now,
you can see the video on my blog. And
is that the general pattern where Assad has enormous weapons, Islamic armies have weapons, and then the popular forces sort of try to do what they can with demonstrations and so on?
Yes, although I don't want to put like a lovely picture of what's happening in Syria, but you still have people demonstrating and resisting against the two forces of the counter-revolution, the Assad regime and its allies, on the ground, Iran, Russia, and the other sectarian militias. And on the other side, Islamic fundamentalist forces going from the so-called Islamic State known as Daesh, Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda branch in Syria, and other fundamentalist Ahrar al-Sham or Islamic Army. And you do have these people still resisting despite the destruction of the Syrian society. And the first responsible for this, I remind everyone, is the Assad regime. 95% of the civilians killed since the beginning of the revolution process in Syria is the Assad regime.
I wanted to ask you about that one group you just mentioned, Ahrar al-Sham. I was shocked when the Washington Post allowed a spokesperson for the group write an op-ed column in their newspaper last month, and the writer claimed that group was among the revolutionaries. What do you say about that group?
They claim they are part of the revolution, just like Jabhat al-Nusra, but they forget that their political objectives, are in complete opposition to the objectives of to the initial objectives of the revolution, which are democracy, social justice, and equality, and against sectarianism. Ahrar al-Sham has a reactionary political program, which is the establishment of an Islamic state. A couple of weeks ago, they issued a statement in the memory of the death of Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban in Afghanistan. They had reactionary practices in the region where they are and even though they fight against the regime, this does not make them part of the revolutionary processes in the meaning in struggling for the same objectives. I said there's different forces of the counter-revolution. In usual, we have one act of the counter-revolution, which is the ancien regime, as we say, the old regimes. But in the case of Syria, and more generally speaking, the Middle East and North Africa and the revolutionary processes, we had also Islamic fundamentalism opposing the demands of the revolutions, represented by democracy and social justice mainly.
Something came up today. The blogger Asa'ad Abu Khalil complained about Western coverage of Syria. He wrote, "What about the ongoing indiscriminate shelling of Damascus, which has been going on for weeks now? Why does that not arouse outrage in Western media? What about the cutoff of water from Damascus? And most importantly, the Syrian rebels have been committing massacres against two villages, which have been held hostage only because they happen to be Shiites." What do you say about that?
There's two things to this, to Asad Abu Khalid claims. First of all, he's a person that has taken since the beginning nearly a non-supportive position towards the Syrian revolutionary process, claiming that most of the opposition is supported by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, whereas in the beginning, in the first 6 months, this was not the case at all. Saudi Arabia forbade any kind of support to the Syrian revolutionaries, and Qatar was a close friend, I remind to everyone, to Bashar Assad, just as, to the Bashar Assad regime, just as Turkey. It's only after 6 months they entered, they supported particular political groups, Islamic fundamentalist political groups, in order to change the nature of this popular revolution to a civil war. And Asad Abu Khalil has had a kind of a similar, very close to even though he was saying the Assad regime is bad, but the opposition is worse. I'm sorry, this is unacceptable when we see the level of repression of this regime. And in his last post article, he even put into doubt that the Duma massacre is real, saying that that happened at a particular time and the opposition is used to do this, etc. So this is first to put back into the framework that Asad Abu Khalil, you cannot criticize the opposition when you're very soft towards the Assad regime. And this is one of the main problems of Asad Abu Khalil, who is not different from the Stalinist and conservative so-called left that we find in the Arab world or elsewhere. On the claims of the opposition, regarding it's not the Syrian Free Army in its totality. Yes, there have been attacks against two villages that are close to that are in rural Aleppo, the two cities you just cited, that are composed of Shia, that have been unfortunately indiscriminately bombed by forces, but no massacres have been committed yet against it. But you should nevertheless condemn the bombardment, the bombing of civilians, because you should not act as the regime. Otherwise, you're betraying the idea, the objectives of the revolution. Just as we have to condemn the bombing of Latakia last week by Islamic fundamentalist groups, just as, and this has what the democratic doing within Syria, condemning the authoritarian practices of Ahrar al-Sham, Jabhat al-Nusra, Daesh, and other similar groups. Activists in Syria that condemned the bombing of Zahran al-Lush, Islamic army, of civilians in Damascus as well. This should be condemned, but I'm sorry, when you see the Western media, there hasn't been such of a big rally in support of the Syrian revolutionaries or for Duma yesterday. So it's a bit on the opposite. There's a kind of silence in front of the massacre, the ongoing massacre against the Syrian revolutionary Syrian civilians from the Assad regime first.
So I just want to clarify one thing. Who was it that attacked? Who is it who is attacking those two cities or villages? What force?
It's a coalition of different forces led by Ahrar al-Sham that bombed these two mainly Shia villages in rural Aleppo. And this must be condemned completely, just as the bombing of certain Christian neighborhoods of Aleppo should be condemned by some Islamic fundamentalist forces or FSA forces. Just as we condemn the permanent bombing of Aleppo neighborhoods that are under the rule of the opposition, mainly Democrat activists and the Free Syrian Army, by the Assad regime for more than a year and a half.
Hmm. Now, let me change the subject here. Who is the United States training in Syria? They mentioned they've trained 60 people. I assume they don't actually train revolutionary forces. Do you have any idea who they're working with?
They're working with very small groups, because most of the groups that um, are part of the Free Syrian Army or claim to be the Free Syrian Army refused this kind of training of the US because the US wanted them to only against Daesh, the Islamic State. Whereas most of the revolutionaries said we had no problem fighting against Daesh, but our main enemy and is the Assad regime, and is the Assad regime that nurture groups such as Daesh or Jabhat al-Nusra by its repression, by its various massacres. So the US, even though we've been talking about the US training Syrian rebels for more than 3 years, and the only result until today is maybe 30 soldiers that have been trained, which is absolutely nothing. And in addition to this, most of the commanders were kidnapped by Jabhat al-Nusra as soon as they wanted to enter Syria. The demand of the Syrian revolutionaries from the Free Syrian Army and the democratic components of the Free Syrian Army to deliver them weapons is still refused until today. Particular weaponry that have been demanded by the Free Syrian Army since the beginning of the Syrian Revolution, without any kind of political condition, of course.
I just have a little bit more for today. Now, some in the left in the United States and Britain oppose U.S. imperialism, but then they look at ISIS and all these horrible head chopping and legitimizing and rape, and they say, well, maybe Assad is the better of three evils. What would you say to them?
I refuse completely this, because first of all, you're never gonna destroy ISIS by the same way you gave it birth in some ways. It was U.S. imperialism, U.S. British intervention in 2003 in Iraq and the destruction of the Iraqi society, and the establishment of a sectarian Iraqi regime, sectarian authoritarian Iraqi regime that nurtured, that allowed the establishment of Al-Qaeda and then Daesh. It's not by bombing new time that you will expect to put an end to just as in Syria. It's not by because Islamic fundamentalists for reasons to come to develop, and one of these reasons have been the decades from authoritarian regimes in the region, starting with Assad regime, Saddam Hussein, and others. So the solution to put an end to ISIS is not only military, it's also political. And you won't accept any kind of end of ISIS without an end of the Assad. It goes hand in hand. We cannot accept. And for the region, it's very important. So oppose US imperialism, but we also oppose Russian imperialism and different forces, such as Iran on one side, Saudi Arabia, Qatar on the other side, or Turkey. And understanding that the military solution is not the end, is not the way to put an end to this kind of reactionary forces. Because Al-Qaeda was nearly to an end in 2008 in Iraq, and it came back in a far worse formation in some ways. ISIS is far worse than Al-Qaeda, but does not mean that Al-Qaeda is good as well.
Yeah. Well, let me ask something I should have asked you before. Could you tell me a bit about yourself and how you got involved in all this revolutionary politics on behalf of Syria?
I'm originally from Syria, but I mostly grew up. I arrived in Switzerland when I was to go back in Syria 2 or 3 times a year, especially when I was 18. My father went back to Syria. And when the revolution began, because I was active outside of the country, I was kind of forbade to come back to Syria because the security services came to my father's place in Aleppo. And especially if an activist that was called Joseph Daher didn't enter really the official propaganda of the regime that all the people opposing the regime were dangerous Islamic fundamentalist forces. And since then, I've also entered a political group in Syria that is the Revolutionary Left Current in Syria. And I also lived in Lebanon from 2011 to 2012. So I had contacts in all the region with different revolutionary groups on the left, in Egypt, Tunis, and elsewhere in Morocco as well. And we've been, after I came back to Switzerland, and therefore been supporting revolutionary processes in the Middle East and North Africa in general, but more particularly in Syria, against the Assad regime and also Islamic fundamentalist forces.
Very good. Well, I appreciate this interview, and we will link to your website, Syria Freedom Forever. Thank you very much for talking.
Thank you very much for the invitation.